It is September 1944. A cold rain falls over a small French village near Metz. Inside a crumbling stone orphanage, 43 children and 4 Catholic nuns huddle together in the dark. The youngest children are only 3 years old, the oldest are 14. They have no food, no trucks, and no way to escape the heavy artillery shells scheduled to rain down on their roof at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. A forward observer spots the children and sends an urgent radio message back to the American lines. The operations officer wants to save them. The logistics officer says it is impossible because every single truck must carry ammunition for the coming assault. It is a brutal calculation of modern warfare. 3 trucks must be stolen from the main supply line, or 43 children will die. But the final decision lands on the desk of a general who refuses to let arithmetic dictate human survival. He will alter the entire battle plan to give these orphans a fighting chance. This is the story of 3 supply trucks that were separated from an army convoy to rescue 43 helpless children from a massive artillery barrage. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the kindness that outranked every order. Captain Thomas Miller was 28 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, and served as the forward operations observer for the 3rd Army. He grew up the son of a high school principal, enlisting the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed some things in the world were worth protecting with a rifle. Over the last 3 months, he had watched his platoon advance across the scorched mud of northern France, seeing comrades fall to hidden mines and sniper fire. Those losses had hardened his resolve, but they had not stripped away his sense of basic decency. When his binoculars captured the sight of 4 frantic women in dark robes trying to carry dozens of small, weeping children down a muddy ditch, something broke inside him. He knew the heavy artillery grid maps already bore the coordinates of that exact square. He refused to sit in his observation post and watch 43 innocent children turned to ash by his own nation's heavy guns. Major Edward Vance was 41 years old, a career logistics officer from Boston, Massachusetts, stationed at the regional supply hub. He viewed the entire European theater not through the lens of human lives, but through the cold, unyielding language of numbers and tonnage. His uniform was perfectly tailored, his leather boots gleamed with fresh polish, and he operated out of a pristine canvas tent far behind the dangerous front lines. Vance believed completely that individual sentimentality was the greatest enemy of military efficiency, often stating that a single delayed truck could lose a war. To him, the calculation was simple, absolute, and beyond any debate. 12 trucks of heavy ammunition meant victory on the battlefield, while 43 foreign orphans meant nothing more than a statistical distraction from the main objective. He sat behind his spotless wooden desk, checked his gold pocket watch, and prepared to let the merciless gears of the army machine grind forward without a single moment of hesitation. By September 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had reached a critical, staggering pace. The German army was retreating toward its own borders, but they were contesting every river crossing, every hill, and every stone village with fanatical desperation. For the American 3rd Army, speed was everything, and speed required an unimaginable volume of supplies, every single division consuming fuel, food, and heavy artillery shells relied on a delicate chain of trucks moving constantly from the Normandy coast to the shifting front lines. Logistics officers worked under immense pressure, knowing that a single broken link in the supply line could halt an entire armored corps and allow the enemy time to dig into defensive positions. In this chaotic environment, the boundary between military necessity and human suffering became blurred. The roads were clogged not just with tanks and weapons, but with thousands of terrified, displaced civilians fleeing the path of the oncoming war. Most American division commanders simply had no resources to spare for these refugees. The prevailing doctrine across the entire theater of operations was clear and uncompromising. Military objectives always took absolute priority, and civilian problems were to be handled by local authorities or left for the rear echelon detachments to resolve weeks later, Dozens of smaller incidents involving stranded locals, ruined farms, and desperate requests for medical aid were routinely ignored by harried staff officers trying to maintain the momentum of the great advance. But the situation developing in the mud outside Metz was rapidly accelerating toward an irreversible tragedy. The heavy artillery batteries were already unlimbering their long barrels, their crews stacking the massive shells that would soon reduce a quiet village to unrecognizable rubble. The countdown toward the scheduled barrage was ticking away in seconds, and the narrow dirt road leading away from the target area remained completely empty. Captain Miller walked into the logistics tent and dropped his mud-stained maps onto the wooden table. Major Vance did not look up from his ledger. Miller wiped the rain from his eyes and said that the artillery barrage, scheduled for dawn, had to be adjusted. He explained that 43 children and 4 nuns were currently moving through the primary impact zone and could not clear the coordinates by 0600. Vance turned a page in his book and answered that the timeline was set by headquarters. Miller stepped closer, stating that the nuns had no vehicles and were carrying the smallest children on their backs through the deep mud. He requested 3 standard cargo trucks to move them 12 miles to the rear before the batteries opened fire. Vance set his fountain pen down, smoothed his uniform jacket, and said that every single vehicle under his command was officially assigned to the ammunition supply lines. Miller leaned over the desk and insisted that 12 trucks of ammunition could spare 3 vehicles for a single hour to save dozens of lives. Vance looked up, his eyes cold, and replied that 3 missing trucks meant 12 tons of heavy shells would fail to reach the frontline batteries before the infantry assault. Miller countered that the regulations allowed for emergency humanitarian diversions when civilian lives were in immediate jeopardy from friendly fire. Vance stood up, adjusted his polished belt, and stated that foreign orphans did not factor into American tactical equations. He said his sole responsibility was to ensure that the maximum tonnage of explosives arrived at the designated supply points on schedule. Miller asked if the major intended to let 43 children get torn to pieces by American steel just to protect a shipping manifest. Vance looked directly at him and remarked that, in the grand scheme of a global conflict, the lives of a few village children were entirely insignificant compared to the operational momentum of the United States Army. Miller stared at him for 3 seconds, realized the major would never budge, and spun around toward the exit. He walked straight to the radio shack to patch a priority report directly to the 3rd Army Command staff. The urgent message reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the supply depot, unannounced. 4 stars gleamed on his helmet, and his signature ivory-handled revolvers rested in the holsters at his hips. The sudden screech of the tires brought an immediate, heavy silence to the entire tent. No one moved. No one spoke. The general walked straight toward the wooden desk, his boots clicking sharply against the floorboards. He stopped inches from Major Vance and looked down at him. His voice was exceptionally quiet, but it filled the room. He asked the major if it was true that he had denied a request for 3 transport vehicles. Vance stood at attention and answered that he had. Patton asked him if he knew that 43 children were currently stranded inside the primary impact zone of the upcoming bombardment. Vance replied that he was aware of the report. Patton then asked if the major believed that a strict adherence to a shipping manifest was more valuable than the lives of those children. Vance stated that his orders were to maintain the ammunition supply line at all costs. Patton studied the officer for a long moment before he spoke. He said that an army is not a collection of ledgers and tonnage reports. It is an organization of men. He remarked that when a commander loses his ability to distinguish between a crate of artillery shells and the lives of innocent children, he ceases to be a soldier and becomes a mere bureaucrat. He explained that Captain Miller had seen the reality in the mud while the major had only seen the numbers on a clean piece of paper. He stated that the Third Army would not build its victories on the graves of orphans. He looked directly into Vance's eyes and delivered his final ultimatum. He told him that he had 2 choices. he could personally oversee the immediate detachment of 3 cargo trucks from the ammunition convoy within the next 10 minutes, or he could face an immediate court-martial for gross insubordination and neglect of duty on the field of battle. He told the major to make his decision right now, because the clock was ticking. Vance swallowed hard, looked at the floor, and quietly agreed to comply. The 3 cargo trucks detached from the main ammunition convoy at exactly 0300. They cut through the dense darkness, their blackened headlights casting minimal illumination on the washed-out roads. By 0400, the heavy metal tailgates dropped open outside the village orphanage. The 4 nuns moved quickly, wrapping 43 children in coarse wool blankets and carrying the smallest ones into the truck beds. Some children cried out in confusion, while others remained completely silent, gripped by terror. The drivers slammed the wooden slats shut and shifted into gear, churning through the thick muck. They raced 12 miles to the rear, arriving at a designated American field hospital just as the first light broke over the horizon. At 0800, the heavy artillery batteries opened fire. The delayed bombardment was deafening. The village was completely torn apart by the relentless explosions, and a direct hit obliterated the stone orphanage, causing every single wall to collapse into a pile of smoking dust. 12 miles away, the rescued orphans sat in a grassy field, eating white bread from American ration tins, completely unaware that their home had just ceased to exist. Captain Thomas Miller returned home to Columbus, Ohio, after the war and took up his father's profession, serving as a dedicated high school principal for over 35 years. He lived a quiet, full life surrounded by his children and grandchildren, never seeking recognition for what happened in the mud outside Metz, and passed away peacefully in the winter of 1982. Major Edward Vance remained in the military bureaucracy until his retirement in 1954, but his upward trajectory within the Army Logistics Command effectively ended that morning in northern France. He lived out his remaining years in Massachusetts, bitter about the marks on his service record, and firmly believing to his final day in 1971 that sentimentality had compromised the integrity of military doctrine. General Patton never recorded the incident in his official reports, never spoke of the rescue to the press, and never sought any credit for the lives saved by those 3 diverted vehicles. His personal aide recorded a single entry in a private diary, stating that the general had delayed an entire offensive for the orphans and told no one. A month after the bombardment, a brief letter from the 4 surviving nuns, addressed simply to the American general, arrived at headquarters. Patton read their words of gratitude in silence, placed the paper into the bottom drawer of his field desk, and never mentioned it again. Some historians have argued that General Patton's decision to alter a major offensive timeline was an irresponsible breach of military discipline that risked the lives of his own frontline troops. They claim that delaying an assault to rescue foreign civilians directly violated standard operational doctrine and could have allowed the retreating enemy force to reinforce their defensive lines near Metz. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the preservation of human life is the ultimate measure of an army's true purpose, and that Patton's quick action demonstrated the deep moral clarity of a great commander. What is certain is that 43 children survived a devastating bombardment that completely erased their home from the earth. If you had been standing in General Patton's boots on that rainy night, would you have ordered the same delay, or would you have prioritized the ammunition lines to secure the standard military objective? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to discover more true stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.